Good morning. So I have a very, very embarrassing confession.
Not another one.
Yes. I have the wrong presentation. Now, by that I do not mean that I brought along one and I left the other one at home. It really is related to that whole notion of assumptions and the danger of assumptions. You see, when Mike and I talked about race and class in 2012, 2012 is for me neither a year nor a number. It's an election year. So the way that I thought about this presentation was not about race and class in this year that happens to be 2012, but race and class in the context of the 2012 elections. So I'm going to just begin there, and I'm apologizing. And I was almost ready to say, well, let me just take a pass, because I don't want to derail this discussion. But I'm too vain to do that, so. Okay. So let's rock and roll. The 2008 election of corporate liberal black president created a series of cascading problems for all classes in the United States. At one and the same time, he was to be the savior of this country in the middle of the worst economic crisis since the Depression. African Americans largely looked at him as someone to reverse the years of the white backlash. Latinos and Asians in tremendous numbers voted for him, looking at various possibilities for a different country. And many whites finding themselves so desperate that they finally had to throw the dice and vote for a black man. Large sections of capital have lost faith in the Republican ability to not only contain the collapse, but also to head off the popular rejection of neoliberalism that was emerging. And everyone but capital saw in Obama what they wanted to see. Actually, I think that capital had a largely accurate idea as to who Obama was. Obama's efforts to save capitalism, much like Franklin Roosevelt's, focused on addressing the needs of capital. At the same time, they involved government expansion, which is antithetical to all that the right believes, except when it comes to the military. Additionally, much of Obama's constituency needed to be addressed by reforms that in essence involved some level of redistributionism. This redistributionism was an anathema to that section of the white population that believed that they and only they are the legitimate recipients of any sort of governmental assistance. Thus, we experienced the Tea Party revolt, a revolt that was less about government, as it now turns out through some interesting studies, and more about the deserving versus the undeserving populations. I'd add here that there are very interesting parallels with the era of Franklin Roosevelt when it comes to these matters, except when it comes to the question of the left. Because in the 1930s, the left, an activist left, the point that Rick Wolf made yesterday in a panel, was involved even in an era of a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress, was involved in pushing the envelope and raising all kinds of struggles. After 2008, the left and much of the left and many progressives largely took a pass and did not seize on the opportunities to push the envelope at all. The right actually followed a path very similar to the right in the 1930s, including an element of the right in the United States that started flirting with the idea of a military coup against Obama, most centered in this kind of weird formation that most of us in the East Coast and in some of the major cities have never heard of, called the Oathers. The Oathers, O-A-T-H-E-R-S, a group that started secretly organizing in the U.S. military and police services to essentially develop a cadre of people that would be ready to move when necessary. And as I said yesterday, think 7 days in May.
Or takers, no?
They,
Go ahead, sir.
yeah. To a great extent, 2012 is about this entire contradiction. It's playing itself out in many respects, including voting rights with Republican voter suppression and the discussion of the alleged illegitimacy of poor people voting, as well as the issue of taking on health care reform. And it's in that sense that particularly we have to thank Theda Skocpol for her study of the Tea Party movement to understand that really bizarre sign that many of us saw and laughed at in 2009 that said, "Government, take your hands off of our Medicare." And I know at the time, most people that I ran into said, these guys they're clearly lunatics, right? Government, take your hands off of Medicare. But what Theda Skocpol was able to ascertain, and which is why it's wrong to look at the Tea Party movement as anti-government. They're anti-government for most of us. They're anti-government for people of color. They're anti-government for young people. They're not anti-government for themselves. They believe that they are the deserving population and that government should serve them. That's very different from crypto-fascists like Bachman. Now, the other piece here is that there are tremendous lessons from the defeat of Reconstruction and the era of the rise of Jim Crow. Because what's interesting in that era, the late 19th century, was the combination of a rising set of labor movements, while at the same time, the disenfranchisement of virtually most of the black electorate, certainly in the South, and huge segments of the white poor. And the disenfranchisement that these sectors have faced then really mirror much of what we're seeing in many states around the country now with what's called voter suppression. For us on the left, we have to understand that 2012 is truly about global apartheid, but it's playing itself out here in the United States. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that Obama is a champion of the dispossessed. But I am saying that the Republicans are lining up as Caligulaites with the intention of reinforcing the health, wealth, education, and employment divisions that have torn the society apart. It is here that right-wing populism enters the picture. Right-wing populism is a toxin among whites that appeals to the side of them that sees a society that they believed existed to serve them as collapsing. They're angry, and actually very angry. Many of them have not known what to make of a black president. Race and class attitudes intersect in some incredibly bizarre ways. On the one hand, recognizing that Obama as a corporate liberal brings forward, at least among white workers, an anti-elitist orientation, which one would say we on the left can build on, except you run into this old nagging problem of race and the fact that this guy happens to be black. And white workers have displayed this amazing characteristic of a willingness to defer and to kiss the ass of white wealth. But when they see it in blackface, racial and class resentments emerge. In 2012, we have also witnessed the rise of political misogynism on a level that is absolutely astounding when you think about the tremendous victories that have been won by the women's movement beginning in the 1950s on through the early 1980s. And this rise of political misogynism has turned the election cycle upside down. But we have to understand that it is the logical extension of right-wing populist mythology, which, in order to explain the declining living standard of the average white working person, in fact, the average working person, is completely obsessed with the collapse of the Leave It to Beaver family myth. And they blame it on women. The fact that there is overwhelming black support for Obama undermines the ability for any real head-to-head challenge to his candidacy and has made much of the discussion of such third-party challenges, frankly, silly. The core progressive constituency in the United States is and remains black America, and most of us are aware of this. That said, the absolute passivity in the face of this administration has been, simply put, unpardonable. And this has been the case since 2009. Very little pressure on this administration and on congressional Democrats, and a continuous willingness on their part to cave, and a willingness on our part to accept that caving and to throw up our hands in despair. Therefore, what can we do? A few things. One, briefly, Occupy was and remains right. We have to take it to the streets. But we also have to, and I want to borrow from something that Mike was raising in the beginning, we have to build on the slogan of the 1%, but never deceive ourselves that we're only up against the 1%. that 1% has a social base that is much, much bigger. And at the level of strategy, we can find ourselves completely blowing it if we only assume that it's us going head-to-head with the Koch brothers. A second is that we need to mobilize the unemployed and organize the precariat. A real task of organized labor, and the left really needs to be focused on this. And what's amazing for me coming out of organized labor is the resistance within organized labor, but not just organized labor. I see it in other social movements, a resistance to organizing the unemployed. Not servicing the unemployed, but organizing the unemployed as a real force. A third is local progressive electoral efforts up through the congressional level. And I think that we have to challenge ourselves and ask, why do we continue to think that politics only exists every 4 years at the presidential level? I mentioned yesterday in another panel the rights of the city. And I think I'm a bit obsessed on this question, that the issue for the left must be urban areas. That's what we have to target. And within this context, and particularly dealing with issues of race and class and gender, we've got to look towards the development of alternative economic development strategies that are advanced through a combination of mass action and electoral efforts. This must be key. This must be a new vision that we have for what the cities need to be looking like, and a way to resist the ethnic, racial, and class cleansings that we've seen in our major metropolitan areas and the creation of dead cities where redundant populations are relocated. And finally, we have to take on right-wing populism. And on this question of right-wing populism, and many of you who've heard me speak before know that this is another obsession of mine, the point is that there's no compromise with right-wing populism. There's none. You cannot separate the populism from the right wing when you're dealing with right-wing populism any more than you can separate the lungs from a human being and expect that they will be able to continue to breathe. Thank you very much.